Oscar, you
Yep.
are heading off to YouTube side. Any last comments?
Well, good luck today, and thank you for doing this. I think it's an important topic to touch upon.
Yeah, same from me. Best of luck. I'm excited to listen to it. Um, I'll still be here. My camera will just be off. But I'm very excited to hear what you have to say.
Great, thanks.
Welcome to our Live and Learn faculty presentations hosted by the University of Oregon's Summer Academy to Inspire Learning program. We are a pre-college program referred to as SAIL. I'm Laura Fernandez, the executive director, and SAIL is a program that serves middle and high school students in their pursuit of higher education. If you have not heard about us prior, please check out our website and join us for some summer programming. We are honored and excited today to be featuring Stephen Beda, a University of Oregon history professor who will discuss history from the bottom up. His teaching typically focuses on race, inequity, and social movements in the United States. And Professor Beda's classes focus on people who have organized change and who are often ignored in history: workers, women, and people of color. If you have any questions during our presentation, please add your questions into the chat feature at any time, and we will be happy to answer. Let's welcome Stephen Beda. Hello.
Great, thank you so much, Laura, for that wonderful introduction. Very pleased to be here with you today, or at least with you digitally. And I'm really excited to talk to you about what it's like to study history at the college level, because the way we approach history in college, I think, is a little bit different than the way some of you may be used to approaching history. And some of the questions we're asking and some of the things we study, I think, are really important to understanding life in America in 2021. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So let me go ahead and share my screen and pull up my presentation. All right. So Laura, is the screen sharing working?
Yes.
Great, wonderful. So, okay, so like Laura said, my name's Steve Beda, assistant professor of history here at University of Oregon. And as Laura said, today I'm going to be talking to you about, what I do as a historian, and what I fundamentally do, if you want to sum it up in a single phrase, is I study history from the bottom up. So I'm going to explain a little bit in a little more detail what I mean by that term. But before I get to explaining that term and explaining kind of what a class with me looks like, and how history at the college level functions, I want to talk a little bit more about what it is I do. And again, Laura gave a great introduction. She said I study race and racial inequality. I study social movements. I study kind of everyday people and how they come together and organize for change. And the kind of way we refer to that in academic history is I'm what's called a social historian. And so what exactly does it mean to be a social historian? Well, kind of as I already said, and Laura already said, I study people whose names you typically don't read about in a history textbook. And the reason you don't read about these people's names in history textbooks is because too often, their names have been lost to history. Because these were people who were often poor, socially marginalized, economically marginalized, people who at the time policymakers and politicians really didn't pay attention to, and subsequently entire generations of historians didn't pay attention to. So really, one of my goals, both in my own research and in the classroom, is to uncover these people's experiences, to understand what life was like for them, what challenges they encountered, and how they address those challenges. So, the types of people that I talk about in my classes are, like you see pictured here, Black sharecroppers in the post-Reconstruction South. That is to say, people who essentially worked on what were called tenant farms, it wasn't slavery, but it was a form of coerced labor. So I try and understand how it was that these people experienced life. I also talk about, factory workers, or like you see here, this was a quote unquote Lowell factory girl. The origins of the Industrial Revolution occurred in the East Coast in the textile industry. And some of the first workers who participated in that industry were young children and young women like you see here. So trying to understand what life was like for them, their challenges, how they experienced America when it was rapidly industrializing. So at the same time I study these sorts of people, I also study the ways in which these people have come together and organized for change. So I study the labor movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, because one of the big important things I try and always impress upon students is that people who were born into the world without power or were born into the world in marginalized places, rarely have they ever accepted their marginalization, their political powerlessness. They have always fought to reclaim power, to combat their marginalization. And really, I think that is the crux or the core of American history, is understanding these people and how their efforts to expand equality and expand justice really shaped America more broadly. So that's what I do as a social historian. I really, like I said, focus on the experiences of people whose names are too often lost to history. Now, I got to admit, when I was in high school, I hated history. I couldn't stand it. I thought it was the most incredibly boring thing around. And when I was a junior or senior in high school, if you would have told me that I was going to be an academic historian, a professional historian, someone who spends their entire life studying this sort of thing, I would have laughed at your face, because I just had no interest in history. And part of the reason that I had no interest in history was because the shape that history took when I learned it. Pretty much when I was in high school, my history textbooks focused on two things: presidents and wars. Yeah, I think maybe there was one chapter about the civil rights movement, but essentially the lesson I learned in high school was that there was a civil rights movement. It started in the 1950s. It involved Martin Luther King. It ends in 1968, and that's okay because Martin Luther King solved all of America's racial problems, which obviously not true whatsoever. But that was the sort of story I got, right? That the action took place either on battlefields or in the White House, and everything else was tangential to history. Now, I don't necessarily know what high school education or high school history education is like today. My understanding is that it's gotten significantly better. But even outside of history, outside of high school, I think most people still associate history with studying presidents and studying wars, with a few footnotes about civil rights activists like King. My dad, God love him, he just loves the History Channel. And every time I go over to visit my parents, he has the History Channel on, and it just bores me to death, because that's the kind of, history you get on the History Channel: presidents and wars, right? So, what I want to demonstrate for you today is that in college, definitely in my class, and certainly in all of my colleagues' classes, we do talk about presidents, because the decisions that powerful people make impact the lives of many. And we do talk about wars, because wars are transformative events that, again, shape and reshape the lives of people. But these aren't our starting places. Rather, our starting places are with the folks I just discussed: Black sharecroppers in the South, industrial workers on the East Coast in the late 19th century. That is where we start. So like I say here, presidents and social movements make history, but they aren't the only people who make history. And like I said, we start with the people whose names have been lost to history and try and understand how they shaped America. And so this is what I mean when I say the way I approach history, and the way many of my colleagues approach history, is history from the bottom up. We take as a starting point civil rights activists in the 1930s. That's the top right picture you see there. Or the sanitation workers who went on strike in Memphis in 1968, as you see in the middle picture. Or young Jewish immigrant women, like you see here, who organized unions to combat coercion on the job. We start there, and then we look at presidents and wars, but always our kind of returning point is common people and how they both experienced and shaped history. All right. So another reason I really couldn't stand history in high school, and my understanding is this has gotten better as well, but one of the reasons I couldn't stand history in high school is because I remember it being a lot of memorization. of me being told to memorize dates and people's names and then regurgitate that on a test. And it just seemed like a lot of kind of mindless busy work, if you ask me. So I put this little, not clip, but cartoon up of Calvin and Hobbes. For those of you who don't know, Calvin and Hobbes was a very kind of prominent, popular comic strip in the kind of 90s. It was big when I was in high school and even before then. It ceased production, but it's still beloved by many. But I love this little snippet here where Calvin, one of the main characters, you see him taking a test. When did the Plymouth land at Plymouth Rock? He answers 1620, and then he says, as you can see, I've memorized this utterly useless fact long enough to pass a test question. I now intend to forget it forever. You've taught me nothing except how to cynically manipulate the system. Congratulations. And then Calvin says, they say the satisfaction of teaching makes up for the lousy pay. So my experience with history and memorization was exactly Calvin's. I figured out how to manipulate tests. I was a good enough student because I would cram and memorize a whole bunch of stuff, but then I would forget it immediately afterwards, and I really, really didn't learn anything. So in my classes, I really don't ask students to memorize dates or names. Now, sometimes you got to, I want students to know general chronologies, right? You got to understand that Reconstruction came after the Civil War. You got to understand that, the 1960s civil rights movement came after early iterations of the civil rights movement. You got to understand a general chronology, but you really don't have to understand dates. Maybe I shouldn't admit this because I'm being recorded, but a lot of times when I have to remember a specific date, or sometimes when I'm putting a lecture together, I'm like, oh, when was this person born? Or what year did this legislation pass? I'll just go onto Wikipedia and look up the date. Because again, like I said, maybe I should admit that, but I really don't mind admitting that, because remembering specific dates like that isn't what history is about. Rather, history is about understanding why things happen, why things change, what social and political and cultural forces impact, decisions people make and how they respond to those changing contexts. And those really are the things that we talk about in my classes. And those are the things I want students to understand. I don't, in my classes, I never use multiple choice tests. I don't think they're a good way of learning or assessing learning. Really, I'm asking kind of interpretive questions, big questions that ask you, why did this happen? And what are the consequences and the meanings of what happened? So the sorts of questions that I ask in all my classes, regardless of whether it's my 20th century American history class that I teach every year, I also teach the Pacific Northwest history class, I also teach a class about the US and Vietnam. Regardless of the class, these are the sorts of questions my classes ask. How is inequality created in American history? And I focus a lot on racial inequality, economic, and gender inequality. Really looking at the decisions that people have made that have both exacerbated inequality as well as challenged it. And indeed, looking at how people challenge inequality is often the kind of core narrative, the major story that I'm telling in my class, all my classes. So we ask about, how is it that people come together and organize for change? How do people understand social movements? Why do social movements come together at specific times? And another question I ask is, what makes a social movement effective? In different times and in different places, social movements have been more effective than others. So I really think it's worth asking what leads a social movement to success and what often dooms it to failure. And so here's why these questions matter. They're important for understanding history more broadly. They're important for reorienting our understanding of history away from kind of presidents and powerful industrialists towards common everyday people. But the other reason that these questions are important is that trying to change a political system, trying to expand economic equality, and ultimately confronting the powerful is a dangerous and often risky thing. This was true going back to the labor movement of the early 20th century, when workers going on strike were routinely fired upon by the National Guard or security officers. This is true of civil rights activists in the early 20th century who tried to organize for change and were often the victims of racial violence, including lynching. And it was just as true during the kind of 1960s civil rights movement, when civil rights protesters, peaceful civil rights protesters, were often met with violence. And as many of you who follow contemporary events and news know, this is just as true today. Many of the same challenges that activists of the past confronted are the exact same challenges that activists of the present are confronting. So really, in my classes, by focusing on the successes as well as failures of past social movements, past efforts to expand social, economic, and racial equality, that provides us a way with thinking about how to organize social movements in the present and moving into the future. And really, that is the core of what I want students to understand in my class. To understand about how the world we're living in today, in 2021, was shaped by historical decisions of the past, and how we can take lessons from the past, how we can learn from activists of the past, and more effectively, change what we don't like about society today. So here's the thing, is that most students who take my classes are not history majors. And I actually assume that most students who take my classes will not become history majors, and that is okay. I hope some of you will become history majors, and I hope some students who take my classes will become history majors. But really, what I want to demonstrate in all my classes is that whether you're a history major or not, whether you're a biology major, chemistry major, English major, it doesn't matter, that history has something to offer everyone. And mainly that's what I just talked about, is that by learning about the past, we can understand the present much better. We can understand how problems in America in 2021 were created. And if you understand how those problems are created, you can more effectively address them. You can more effectively organize for change. So one of the things I say in my classes is that I don't study the past, nor do I ask my students to study the past. I study and I ask my students to study the present and to learn how the present was created and how we can ultimately create a more just future using the past as our guide. So that, like I said, is the approach to all my classes. Now, to kind of give you a little bit of an example of how it is that I structure my classes, I just kind of want to take you through, one of my kind of largest history classes that I teach, and that's History 203, 20th Century US History. So like I say, this class, like all my classes, I take this bottom-up approach. I start with kind of common everyday people and look at their experiences. And doing this presents an alternate chronology of American history, one that you don't normally get in high school history textbooks. Well, at least I didn't get it in my high school history textbook. I don't know, what sorts of textbooks that you're using today. Like I said, my understanding is things have gotten a little bit better, but still, focusing on history from the bottom up presents a sort of different narrative or a different story of America. And like I said, I want to give you just a brief overview of the story I tell. So instead of kind of, focusing on a purely chronological approach, I tend to take a more thematic approach. And really in my 20th century history class, we have 4 kind of central units, and I got them listed here. We start with immigration, then we talk about workers and the labor movement, then civil rights movements. You'll see that is plural there. I will explain what I mean by that. And then women, then we end with a thematic unit on women and women's movements. So let me kind of go through these a little bit more, explain to you the questions that I ask and how we address them. And like I said, all in the interest of giving you a sense of kind of what the focus is at the college level. So starting with immigration. So as we know from contemporary politics, the most recent presidential election, let alone the last 4 years of politics at the national level, immigration is constantly being debated and contested in American politics. And so one of the things I focus this unit on is understanding why. Why is it that immigration is such a contested, oftentimes vitriolic and acrimonious issue? The sorts of questions we ask are, why are some immigrant groups more socioeconomically mobile than other immigrant groups? So one of the things I talk about in class is my family, half my family has kind of roots in Polish immigration. The other half has roots in Italian immigration. And the political system has allowed some socioeconomic mobility for Polish and Italian immigrants, which in part has created opportunities for me to become a college professor. If my family were a member of a different immigrant group, that might not be the case. So we try to understand how inequality was structured through immigration and immigration law and policy, and how immigrants challenge these at different points. I also pay a lot of attention to immigration from Mexico and Latin America, particularly because since the 1950s, Mexican and Latin American immigrants have been central to America. So what you see pictured here are braceros. Braceros were guest workers who came over to the United States to work in the agricultural system during World War II. And then the program continued into the 1950s and 1960s. And as a result of this program, from roughly the 1940s onwards, Mexican immigrants have, supported America's agricultural industry. One of the things I argue in my classes is that World War II was not won by Allied troops fighting over in Europe and the Pacific Theater. World War II was won by braceros working fields in California and here in Oregon and Washington, because they provided the food that fueled the nation and allowed it to fight. Yet at the very same time, braceros and Mexican immigrants were supporting America's economy, its agricultural sector. They were increasingly being demonized. They were increasingly being criminalized. And indeed, in the 1950s, there were large, very disturbing deportation programs that rounded up tens of thousands of Mexican workers and deported them, returned them to Mexico. So here you see a very unsettling image of workers who were part of this deportation campaign locked in a cage. And again, that's another image that's unfortunately familiar to us in 2021 of immigrants being detained in cages. And the point here is that there is precedent for this. But one of the things I want to understand is, how is it that Mexican Americans became both central to America and at the same time marginalized in America, and trying to understanding that contradiction. And at the same time, I'm always interested in how people push back against this. So at the same time, we will talk about deportation policies and the criminalization of Mexican and Latin American immigrants. We will also talk about movements like the United Farm Workers, which in the 1960s started to organize farm workers and press for better wages and better living and working conditions on America's farms. So that's part of the story we tell about immigration. One of my favorite units is talking about the labor movement. Now, the labor movement doesn't get a whole lot of attention in American politics broadly. We talk a lot about immigration and civil rights, really important, necessary conversations to have. We talk less about workers' economic rights. And I actually think this is a big mistake, because one of the things I argue in my class is that you can't have racial justice without economic justice. And indeed, unions have been one of the central ways of preserving or maintaining or expanding economic rights and racial rights as well. So in the background here, you see an image that many of you may recognize. This was the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers strike. This was also, unfortunately, the place where Martin Luther King was assassinated. And King came to Memphis to support the sanitation workers strike because Martin Luther King understood the value and importance of labor unions in the larger struggle for civil rights. So that's one of the things we explore, the ways in which these two movements are connected, they're linked together, the ways in which expanding, workplace rights has impacted civil rights and vice versa. We also talk about, why is it that unions are in decline? Why, if they are such crucial mechanisms for protecting economic and racial inequality, why have they, kind of gone downhill throughout the 20th century? So that's another big question we ask. Now, I actually think this question is taking on new pertinence and new importance. Those of you who follow the news may have heard that there's kind of some new rounds or we may be entering a new era of union organizing. Workers at Google and companies like Uber are starting to talk about unions, are starting to organize unions. And I think this is great. It's really interesting. And like union movements of the past, we see in a lot of union movements at places like Google and Uber, a focus not just on workplace rights, but also broader racial rights. So, one of the things I argue in my class is that, these movements are really interesting. They are in some regards different from previous union movements, but you can also, these movements may be able to learn something from past union movements. So as I say here, what can union activists at companies like Google and Uber learn from activists who organized unions at General Motors and Ford in the 1930s? And as I would suggest, they can actually learn a lot. All right. One of, I keep saying, I said the labor movement unit was one of my favorites, and that's true. But really, one of my other favorites is the civil rights unit in my class. One of the big things I impress upon students is that, contrary to what I learned in high school, the civil rights movement did not simply take place in the 1950s and 1960s. Now, that was a hugely important era for civil rights activism, but you can't understand civil rights activism in the 50s and 60s without understanding previous fights for racial justice. One of the things I always say in my class is that the civil rights movement probably started sometime in the 17th century when an enslaved African who was forcibly brought to what was then the British or French colonies resisted their master. They refused to work, or they broke a tool, or they feigned illness to get out of work. That was when the civil rights movement started, sometime in the 17th century, and it has continued unabated up till, as we saw this summer and fall, up to the present. Now, one of the things we talk about is the ways civil rights activism has shifted and changed. But one of the things I try and always impress upon students is that central to American history, at the core of American history, perhaps the most important consistent story in American history is civil rights struggle. So we'll talk about people unfortunately that you don't read a lot about in history textbooks. People like you see on top right there, W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was one of the founders of the NAACP, the longest standing civil rights organization. He helped found it in 1905. Du Bois was also the first Black person to receive a PhD from Harvard. He was a sociologist, and he did a lot of really important pioneering work trying to understand racial inequality in the early 20th century. He was also a historian, and he pushed back against racist interpretations of the Civil War. And indeed, today in 2021, historians writing about the Civil War still cite Du Bois's work. And Du Bois was one of the leading theorists about race and racial inequality. And understanding his ideas and what he said about race and racial inequality in the early 20th century helps us understand racial inequality then and helps us understand it today. So Du Bois is someone that every American should know. Likewise, every American should know about this guy you see pictured below, A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was, again, one of the figureheads, one of the leaders of the civil rights movement before the 1950s and 1960s. He was the president of the Sleeping Car Porters Union. Essentially, sleeping car, back in the day, early 20th century, before you had airline travel, if you were wealthy, you traveled in what was called a sleeping car, across the country in a sleeping car. Essentially, you had your own car, and you had a porter who would essentially cater to your needs. Porters were overwhelmingly Black workers, and they were poorly paid, and they were very much exploited by the oftentimes affluent people who booked passage on a sleeping car porter. And so in the 1920s, they started to unionize, and they nominated A. Philip Randolph to be their president. And A. Philip Randolph really helped that union grow, helped that union expand their rights in the workplace. And then A. Philip Randolph became a leader in the national civil rights movement. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph, in an effort to integrate both the military and wartime industry, planned to lead a march on Washington. Now, that never happened because the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, ultimately capitulated to Randolph's demands and said he would integrate wartime industry. However, roughly 20 years later, another civil rights activist, Martin Luther King, actually looked back to Randolph's idea when he organized the 1963 March on Washington. And in fact, Randolph was a key person in organizing the 1963 March on Washington. If you actually go back and look at some of the footage, you will see Randolph pictured there. So these are the kinds of things that we focus on, looking at a long history of civil rights activism. Now, earlier in the presentation, and again on this slide, you see that I say movements, plural, because another thing I always impress upon students is that while the Black freedom struggle was a hugely important part of the larger civil rights movement, it wasn't the only one. So we spend as much time talking about American Indian activism and Asian American activism and the Chicano movement, and situate those within a broader history of civil rights struggle, looking at how these movements reflected the Black freedom struggle and how they also differed from them at the same time. Another thing I include in my history of the civil rights movement is what was called the gay liberation movement. It's, the name for kind of the gay rights movement and LGBTQ movement has taken on various names and forms throughout history, but really it was rooted in the same kind of civil rights movement of the kind of mid 20th century as well. So that's another kind of, movement that is part of this larger story of civil rights movements. And then another topic, one of the things I said is, I am always very much focused on how people organize for change, but I'm also in my classes focused on the larger structures, political, policy, cultural, social structures that create inequalities. And so one of the things I also talk about in the context of civil rights history, something that unfortunately still has very much relevance today, is the long history of police brutality. So Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement is a hugely important movement. Undoubtedly, future historians are going to be writing about Black Lives Matter for a long time. It's going to be the key civil rights movement of our era. At the same time, what Black Lives Matter movement activists are fighting for has long been an issue of civil rights activists. Going back to the late 19th century, there is ample evidence of police brutality, of predominantly white police officers enacting violence against communities of color. And that is unfortunately a consistent part of American history. So one of the things we try to understand in my class is, why is it that policing has continually been a problem in American history? Why has policing often reflected racial inequalities in American history? And how has policing exacerbated those racial inequalities? And we also look at kind of movements to address this. So as important as Black Lives Matter is, it is far from the first civil rights movement to try and address this. One of the best, most well-known movements to address this was the Black Panthers. That the Black Panthers, one of the major reasons they organized was to essentially try and hold police accountable, to try and prevent police violence. What Black Panthers said was, we do not need white officers policing Black communities. Black communities are perfectly capable of protecting themselves. So we talk about some of the great things the Panthers did. We also talk about some of their missteps and why their movement at times faltered. And so then, like I said, the last thing we end with is a history of women in the women's movement. So, just like police brutality is not a problem unique to our own time, neither, unfortunately, is sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workplace. So we look at that long history and, again, try and understand, why is it that this has been such a pervasive problem in American history? Another thing I talk about is, for roughly about 40 to 50 years, the women's movement has been trying to get an equal rights amendment in the Constitution. So our Constitution, because of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, has very specific language about race and about equal protection under the law. What it does not have is specific language about gender. Now, oftentimes, legal scholars and legal activists have argued quite effectively that women are included in the provisions of the 14th Amendment, but that has also created significant problems. So since the 1960s, women have been pushing for an equal rights amendment, constitutional language that will specifically create protections for women. And yet we do not have an equal rights amendment, despite the best efforts of many women's activists. So in my class, we ask, why is that the case? One of the most fascinating, interesting conversations I like to have in my kind of discussion of the women's movement is the relationship between gender rights and racial rights. Is that throughout American history, going back to the early 20th century and the suffrage movements of the progressive era, women have often debated, particularly women of color have often debated, whether they should focus on racial rights first and then gender rights, or focus on gender rights and then worry about racial rights. And so there's always been this long conversation amongst women's rights activists about, where do we place our focus? And this, I think, is important, because one of the important things to understand about when you study social movements is that rarely are activists agreed upon tactics and policy focuses, that there's always been fundamental disagreements. And sometimes those disagreements can be really good for a movement, and sometimes they can also hamper a movement. But in answering this question about race and gender, the person I always like to turn to, and the person I speak a lot about in my classes, is another one of these important activists in American history that I wish every American knew her name, but unfortunately many don't, and that is Pauline Murray. So Pauli Murray was a civil rights activist in the 50s and 60s. She was the first Black woman to receive her Juris Doctorate, that is to say, graduate law school from Yale Law School. She was also the first Black woman to be appointed in a minister in the Episcopal Church. She was a longtime civil rights activist and a longtime women's rights activist. She was one of the co-founders of NOW, the National Organization of Women. And to this question of whether women of color should forefront women's rights or the rights of people of color, Pauli Murray said that is a false choice. She said that a civil rights movement can only be effective insofar as it advocates for both women's rights and the rights of communities of color. And she coined a new term in the 1960s. She called it Jane Crow. And that was a play on Jim Crow, the system of Southern segregation. And what Pauli Murray meant by that was essentially, women, and particularly women of color, are marginalized both as a function of their gender and race, and that in order to really achieve equality, you must attack both those things simultaneously. So today, a lot of scholars use this fancy word intersectionality to refer to the various ways in which different struggles with gender, class, and race are all tied together and linked. Well, Pauli Murray was making this argument well before scholars did, in the present day. So again, she's another important figure to talk about, and another important figure we focus on in my classes. So, all right, so I kind of gave you a brief overview of what it is we do at the college level, the sorts of things we study. But now I want to turn to this question of how do we actually study that stuff? So here's one of the things, I've hopefully impressed upon you by now is that, I'm really focused on history from the bottom up, of looking at the experiences of activists and common day people who are too easily ignored in history. Now, one of the reasons those people are ignored in history is because oftentimes historical documents and sources don't record those people's experiences. We have voluminous evidence of presidents and generals and all these kind of big, powerful people. They left records, and then, later in the 20th century, archivists and librarians, they preserved those people's records, and the records of working people, the records of Black sharecroppers, no one ever thought to record those. At the same time, because oftentimes marginalized peoples, didn't have the same educational opportunities as powerful peoples, they didn't leave the same sorts of records. They didn't necessarily leave diaries and journals or policy statements and stuff like that. Because essentially, like I said, they didn't have the educational opportunities that allowed them to author their sources. So this creates sort of a problem in history is, if we want to get to the experiences of common everyday people, how do we do that if traditional historical sources don't record or speak to their experiences? So in my class, so through sometimes digging and some good old-fashioned detective work, you can sometimes turn up sources that recount the experiences of everyday people. And a lot of times in my classes, I'll assign some of those sources. I'll have students read them. But really, I think if you only limit yourself to traditional sources, that is to say newspapers, diaries, government documents, you're really missing a big part of the story. So at the same time, I do assign and ask students to read more traditional documents. I often turn to things that aren't considered traditional documents in history, things like music and art and literature, things or the sorts of devices where kind of normal everyday people recorded their experiences. And really, I think these are oftentimes more effective sources to look at to understand how it is that people organized for change. So one of the things I'll often do in my classes is, put up a picture or a piece of art produced by someone in a civil rights movement. And, as a class, we'll talk about it. So really, in all my classes, I try and avoid lecturing. I see lecturing as a necessary evil. Sometimes it is necessary, sometimes it is the only way to deliver instruction, particularly when you have a large class, or particularly, given online education with the pandemic where kind of interaction is more difficult. That's not to say I don't try, even with Zoom and online teaching, to create a collaborative atmosphere with a lot of discussion. I'm always trying, but really, hopefully soon, once we return to in-person classes, hopefully by the time that some of you are studying college in the fall, we'll be back to something resembling normal. We'll be able to be back in person. And if so, and you take one of my classes, which I hope you do, I want you to know that I'm going to do my best to limit lecture and encourage discussion and participation, because that's the best way to learn. So oftentimes, one of the things I'll do is I'll put a picture up on the PowerPoint slide, and we'll have a discussion about what can we learn about history and the experience of activists from these pictures. So on the right, you see a mural that's in Chicano Park in San Diego, a mural created by Chicano activists. It's a beautiful mural. Any of you in Southern California who have the opportunity should definitely go see this public art project. It is amazing. But those are the sorts of things we talk about. One of my favorite things to talk about is, this is the picture on the left there. It's a painting by Barclay Hendricks. It's called Icon for My Superman, and in parentheses, Superman Never Saved Any Black People. I just think this is a fascinating image. And this, this painting with Hendricks himself, and this painting was produced in the context of the Black Power movement, when there were new conversations about Blackness and how it related to American society. And I think you can just, it's a simple picture that I think speaks volumes about the ways in which Blackness and Black power was being articulated. One of the things I absolutely love to do is play music and play songs. Students who have taken several of my classes, we have a running joke about Woody Guthrie, that, I say, if Woody Guthrie didn't sing about it, it's not important knowing it, which that's not exactly true. But Woody Guthrie, Depression era folk singer who sang about civil rights and labor rights. And again, he himself was part of the Dust Bowl migration. His family lost their farm to the bank during the Depression. So Woody Guthrie was often singing about the experiences of the downtrodden as one of the downtrodden. We can learn so much from his music and the honesty with which it speaks. And likewise, I say you can't understand the civil rights movement without understanding the music of the civil rights movement. Songs like We Shall Overcome, or any of the kind of popular civil rights songs of that era, that is what motivated people. That is what articulated a sense of purpose. And that was ultimately what drove people to participate in the civil rights movement. So, at the same time, we will look at some of more historical sources. We're going to spend just as much time looking at songs, looking at art, reading literature, because I think those are invaluable historical sources. So here's the big point, the last thing I'll leave you with before I turn to some questions. And the one thing I want you to understand, and like I said, whether you become a history major or not, I want to, hopefully I've demonstrated to you that taking a history class, whether it's from me or one of my colleagues, we're all great, is that there's value in history. And that value is a better understanding of the present. So like I said, students and me, we don't study the past, we study the present. We try and understand how America in 2021 looks as it does, how it was created by history. And really, what I want students to always think about is how can we preserve what is good about American society and politics? And just as importantly, how can we most effectively change what we don't like? How can we expand justice, economic, racial, and gender? How can we continue these fights that generations of activists have started? So those are the big things I want students to walk away with. And again, like I say, hopefully some of you become history majors, but it's okay if you don't want to become a history major. Take a history class, because the lessons you learn in a history class, my hope is they will be applicable to whatever field or career you ultimately choose. So with that, I'd love to take some of your questions.
We have a lot of questions. So this has been so inspirational, Professor Beda. I love your concept of bringing in the music and art as a strategy, because that really, I think, opens up the interest level especially with our high schoolers. And that goes into one of these questions, flows right into one, is as a high school student, how can I bring light to the alternatives of history in history? So
I'm going to stop the share. So I'm sorry, Larry, can you repeat the question one more time?
It says, as a high school student, how can I bring light to the alternatives history?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, that's a wonderful question, and that's a great question. I think that all historians are wrestling with, especially even academic historians. One of the things that we academic historians do is we write history. I don't just teach history, I also research and write history, but oftentimes I'm just writing for, journals and other academics. And so I'm constantly thinking about how can I push back against the History Channel? How can I push back against, the massive textbook industry, which forwards oftentimes a problematic narrative of history? One of the things I think is that, online, message boards and not message boards, but, social media has a lot of problems, no doubt about it. But social media can also be an effective tool for disseminating alternate views of history and, disseminating a narrative of history that's focused on race and racial justice. So one of the things I've started to do is there's several great historians who, are very ubiquitous on Twitter. So just subscribing to their feeds are a good way to start engaging with this history, and then disseminating their tweets is a way to kind of get word out there. Same thing with, for all the problems that Facebook has caused in contemporary society, again, it's another opportunity to help disseminate information. And again, I know I am so old and so uncool that I'm still talking about Facebook. I know all you young kids are on social media platforms that I don't even know the name of, but I would say use that as a potential opportunity to spread, information about history. The other thing too is about the internet is, what's nice about the internet is you don't have to be an academic historian with a PhD to do history, right? There are several great blogs I follow about history that I've learned a lot from that are not written by academic historians. So you probably possess the digital wherewithal to do something like that. You can do that. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. So, off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly some of the ones I go to, but students. So Laura, I don't know if students have follow-up questions with emails, they're free to email me. I don't know if you'd like them to email the SAIL program and then you forward it to me, or I'm happy to give out my email address directly. Or you can just find it.
Email is fine. If you can even, we can add it to this this presentation for folks for the history.
So my email, it's sbeda, SBEDA @uoregon.edu. Anyone watching is free to email me with questions, and I'm happy to answer. And yeah, I'd be happy to make recommendations for some of the digital historians I follow. Because like I said, that's potentially a way to push back against the massive textbook industry and the History Channel.
So another question, you've kind of answered this, I think, but do you think everyone should take a history class at some point in their life? And if they take yours, how many students would they experience in your classes?
Mm-hmm. So, well, I mean, I got to admit, I'm very biased in this regard. But yes, I absolutely think everyone should take a history class for the reasons I've hopefully already stated, right? That no matter what you study, history can help you understand that topic better. Really, history makes, I think, you a better citizen. I don't necessarily mean citizen in a nationalistic way. History makes you a better global citizen. It teaches you about other peoples, other cultures. A famous saying in history is the past is a different country. They do things differently there. That's to say, by understanding history, you get an appreciation of difference and how to think about difference and how to negotiate difference. So yeah, everyone should take a history class with the caveat that I am indeed biased. So yeah, and as far as classes with me go, they really run the gamut of different sizes. So that History 203 class, which I mentioned, I kind of gave you the outline, that's a large class. It's roughly 200 students. Now, despite having 200 students, I try and make it as personal and interactive as possible. What that class does have, though, which is invaluable, is sections. So, twice a week, usually you'll meet with me and the entire lecture, all 200 students, but then once a week, you will have a smaller discussion section where it's only you and roughly about 30 other students, and you'll meet with a graduate employee. That is to say, a graduate student who's working with me, helping me teach the class. And they'll lead a discussion that is definitely less lecture and more kind of interactive, where you have like debates and you sometimes play educational games and stuff like that. So even in those big classes, there are often opportunities for kind of smaller interaction. Now, once you get into upper division courses, at least in the history department, classes tend to get smaller. So my Pacific Northwest history class is about 30 students. Some of the other classes I've taught at the upper division level are about 30 students. So really it runs like I said, runs the gamut.
Um, do you have an interesting fact that many people don't usually know about? And you must, with all of these unknown people that you tell stories about.
Oh man, where do I start? An interesting fact that not a lot of people know about. Again, it's one of those things where you put on the spot. Like I got a million things in my brain competing for space. I'm trying to think. Let's see.
Like, for example, the Jane Crow, that was new to me,
Yeah,
actually. I
so
wasn't familiar with that.
Murray and Jane Crow. Another interesting fact that I always talk about, I already mentioned it, but one I always like to tell people is that Martin Luther King didn't come up with the idea of the March on Washington, right? The March on Washington was A. Philip Randolph's idea, and had A. Philip Randolph not articulated that idea in 1941, then one of the kind of landmark events of the 1960s civil rights movement, excuse me, had its antecedents in earlier generations of the civil rights movement. So that's a kind of fun fact that I always like, telling people, because I think it illustrates this idea of thinking about a long civil rights struggle, not simply limiting it to the 50s and 60s. I'm trying to think what other. Yeah, I mean, there's really, some of them aren't so nice, but another really important thing that I talk about in my classes. So I didn't mention the environmental movement or the conservation movement, but those are things I talk about too. The conservation movement actually has its origins in eugenics of the early 20th century. That most conservationists were eugenicists, and they in the early 20th century. And they believed that by preserving redwoods or buffalo or whatever, that was a way to preserve the white race. And indeed, the early conservationists, John Muir among them, had just horrendous ideas about native peoples and indigenous peoples because they saw them as occupying land that should be preserved for white people. So that's not a very uplifting one, but I think it's an important one to understand. Trying to think. I've just been writing a lot about environmental history and conservation history lately. So those are kind of all the ones in my mind. I keep coming up with really sad, depressing ones, but and some of you may know this, but for most of the 19th century into the early 20th century, Oregon's constitution prohibited free black people before the Civil War, freed black people after the Civil War. And freed black people before the Civil War. It prevented black people from essentially owning land in Oregon. That was in the state constitution. Oregon also in the 1920s had the highest per capita Ku Klux Klan membership. People think about the Ku Klux Klan as a Southern organization, and in some eras it was, but in the 1920s it was a national organization. And like I said, per capita, Oregon had more Klan members than any other state. Oh God, I can't just end with like these sad, depressing ones. I'm trying to think, what could I talk about that's a uplifting, positive one? I'm just looking at books on my desk, thinking about something I could. Yeah, the problem is that we historians, we are a fairly dour bunch, so we tend to write about really sad, depressing things.
How about a successful women's movement fact?
There have been several successful women's movements. Well, I actually think one of the kind of most successful women's movements occurred in the 1970s when essentially, I talked about essentially sexual harassment not being unique to our time. So essentially, there were several movements that organized in the 1970s that effectively created a lot of the legislation and effectively created a lot of the institutions policy institutions that women in the Me Too era were effectively able to use, and some of the legal mechanisms they were effectively able to use in order to challenge discrimination in the workplace. So again, that's another story where, just like the civil rights movement, the women's movement of our own era ultimately relied on legal tools that had been created by women's movement activists in the 1970s. Another kind of unknown one. I should have thought of this one too earlier. So Betty Friedan. Many of you may know Betty Friedan. She was, along with Pauli Murray, one of the founders of the National Organization of Women. And Betty Friedan wrote this very famous book that was central to the women's movement. It was called The Feminine Mystique. And what that book was about the difficulties that middle-class women faced in kind of traditional domestic households where they were expected to do all the domestic labor, bear children and raise children, as well as do all the housework. And so Betty Friedan really associated herself with kind of this middle-class feminist movement. Well, it turns out that Betty Friedan actually got her start in the 1930s writing for the labor press, that she was a labor activist before she was a women's activist. And she actually saw the labor movement as a means of expanding women's power before she kind of turned against it. And we don't know this for certain, but there is pretty good circumstantial evidence that Betty Friedan in the 1930s was a member of the Communist Party, because she saw in the Communist Party and its calls for economic equity a means of preserving gender equity. So really, again, the middle class feminist movement of the 70s really has its origins in working class history in the 1930s and the American Communist Party, which again doesn't get talked a lot about in classrooms.
Fantastic. There's some other questions about the books that you and resources that are taught and or that you use to teach. That leave out so many perspectives. What is the reason that schools are still using books that only have one narrative and limited perspectives?
Oh, that's a great question. I could probably talk for the next hour, if not longer, about why that's the problem.
The short
yeah.
answer.
So first, I want to say, generally the problem is not your teachers in high school history. I know several of my students have gone on to be high school history teachers. Many of my classmates, both in grad school and before, are high school history teachers. So me and your high school history teachers, we learn the same stuff and we have the same commitment to history. But the problem is oftentimes school boards or textbook manufacturers who don't listen to what we have to say. I think that the reason is because, history is fundamentally political. All history is politicized. Get out of your mind the idea that there is an objective history. There's just no such thing. And so for much of American history, and definitely in the present, we've definitely saw this with some of the kind of orders that Trump passed in the waning days of his presidency with new standards for history education. A lot of people have believed that the fundamental role of history is to champion the American nation and to support the American nation and to encourage patriotism. And because they have believed that, they have often turned a blind eye to some of the ugly, nasty things in American history, and then as a consequence told a distorted view of the successes of American history. So like I said, what I learned in high school was Martin Luther King died in 1968, but that was okay because he solved American racism. And again, that's the kind of story that you get told, because that is a story that leads to a kind of patriotic understanding of American history. Unfortunately, it's one that is unsupported, completely unsupported by the evidence. So yeah, one of again, if I'm summing up a lot of kind of complex policy and decisions, but one of the reasons is I think is that people who author those textbooks or create those curriculum often do so because they believe that the purpose of history is to broaden patriotism. Now, here's the thing: is I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think to be a better American, to be a better patriot, is to not simply focus on good things. It is to focus on the bad things, to ask, how can we correct those bad things, and to use history as a guide to correcting those bad things. So again, a lot of times students will say like, oh, going to your classes is so depressing, and it often is, but I do that not out of a sense of pessimism. I don't talk about racism and racial violence and sexism and all these things because I enjoy that. I'm not doing it out of a sense of pessimism. I'm ultimately doing it out of a sense of optimism, that if we can understand these problems, we can address them and create a more just future.
So well said. I'm so glad you are a teacher out there. Time for one last question, and this is a very leaves us on a positive note, I think. Here was what is one of your favorite moments or memories from one of your classes?
Oh God, I have so many. I mean, just teaching is so rewarding. Let me answer that in a broad way, because this has happened several times. one of my favorite experiences in classes is when a student will actually disagree with my interpretation, right? And again, oftentimes this requires a level of comfort in class, a level of comfort I try and encourage in students. But when a student will push back against what I say, they'll say, well, you said this, but actually this. And that is always such an uplifting moment for me because, as I just said, there's no such thing as objective history. History is about interpretation. History is about taking a lot of this oftentimes disparate evidence and telling a story. And one of the reasons that, I as a historian will always have a job is because interpretations are always changing. So when a student feels comfortable enough to offer their own interpretation, one that pushes back against me, I get so excited because that means now that student has gone from a student of history to an actual historian. They are forwarding their own interpretation. So like I said, that's happened a bunch, and I always get so excited when that happens. So I always tell students, I don't discourage disagreement. I welcome disagreement because disagreeing and debating and arguing over, intellectually arguing over what interpretations mean and how to interpret evidence, that is how we figure out what history is. And that is ultimately how we create better history that resists those kind of simplistic narratives that I just critiqued and ultimately leads us to more complicated and at the same time, more useful political or historical narratives. So really those times when students have said, I'm going to disagree with you on that, Steve. I'm going to push back against you. I'm like, bring it on, let's talk, let's have a discussion. So those are my favorite moments.
That's really nice for students to know that it's an opportunity to be engaged in conversation about these things.
Conversation is really, I think, the key word. And thanks, Laura, for saying that. But yeah, history is about conversation. It's about discussing. It's about debating. And that's what the crux of what I try and do in a college classroom is encourage discussion and debate because those things are good.
Well, I think you've been successful today, Stephen. We have comments that we would like to take your class, and this was a great presentation. And yeah, it really, you're very inspiring and easy to talk to. I can tell that you have some energy that will create a safe space to be able to have conversations. So we really appreciate you being with us today. We will be posting this on our website, and folks who didn't get an opportunity to see it today or have family or friends that you'd like to share it with, please do so. Steve, would you like to leave us one last time with your email address?
Yeah, sure. It's sbeda, SBEDA @uoregon.edu. So, and again, if you ever forget that, you can just go on if you just Google UO history and then click on the link for faculty, you'll see me at the top of the list because it's alphabetical order. So,
and you'll be on our website too. So thanks again, Stephen. We'll be talking soon and maybe we'll see you this summer.
Sounds great.